Comrades, listen closely, for what I reveal today is not a mere abstraction, but the very skeleton of your daily existence, the hidden framework that binds you in chains you scarcely perceive. You labor, you toil, you sweat, and yet the fruits of your labor vanish into the pockets of a few who neither create nor deserve. This is no accident. This is not the law of nature. It is the deliberate construction of an invisible architecture of oppression, erected by those who profit from your submission. Look around you. The society you inhabit appears neutral, even fair, but it is a cunning illusion. Schools teach obedience, workplaces teach compliance, and the media saturates your mind with the belief that inequality is inevitable. But these structures are not natural, they are engineered. They are instruments of control, designed to fragment your power and obscure your collective strength. The rich, the ruling class, wield not only wealth but ideology itself as a weapon, shaping your desires, your fears, and even the language you use to understand your world. Capitalism thrives because it disguises its exploitation as freedom. You are told you are free, yet your hours, your energies, your very creativity are sold in exchange for survival. The worker produces more than the value she receives. The laborer creates worlds she will never inhabit. Every hour you dedicate to the system is an hour in which you build your own chains. This exploitation is not incidental, it is systemic. It is structural, and it is invisible because its architects understand that consciousness is the first step toward liberation. Do not be deceived by the spectacle of competition, for it is a ruse. The system trains you to compete against your fellow workers, to envy, distrust, and fragment. You are pitted against one another in a false struggle, while the true enemy, the class that thrives on your toil, grows ever more powerful. This division is intentional for the unity of the working classes, the ultimate threat to the existing order. Yet, recognize this, the invisible architecture of oppression is not eternal. Its foundations are built upon your labor, and it can be dismantled by the collective force of the workers themselves. History is not written by gods or kings, it is written by the masses when they awaken to their power. When the working class understands the conditions of its oppression, when it sees the chains imposed upon it, it becomes unstoppable. Awareness is the first weapon, organization is the second, and action is the final, irrevocable force. The architects of your oppression fear your clarity. They fear the moment when the exploited recognize their shared condition, when solidarity replaces division, when conscience becomes action. For then the invisible walls that cage you, walls of ideology, of legal structures, of economic coercion, will crumble under the collective pressure of a united proletariat. The factories, the offices, the streets, all become theaters of liberation, when the masses rise with purpose and intellect intertwined. Comrades, this is not a call to reform, for reform leaves the architecture intact, it merely paints over the cracks. True liberation requires not patchwork, not negotiation with your oppressors, but the complete dismantling of the system that profits from your suffering. It requires seizing the means of production, reclaiming the surplus of your labor, and reshaping society according to the principles of justice and equality. You are not powerless. You are not alone. The chains that bind you are forged in the halls of wealth and policy, but they are composed of nothing that cannot be broken by the collective strength of your numbers, your solidarity, and your consciousness. Let this day mark the beginning of your clarity, the moment in which the invisible becomes visible, and the architecture of oppression stands exposed before your united gaze. Rise, comrades, organize, educate, and mobilize. Break through the walls that were built to contain you. Do not accept the invisible as inevitable. Let the labor of your hands, the sweat of your brow, and the fire of your minds forge a new society. A society in which exploitation is abolished, in which wealth is shared, and in which freedom is no longer a promise sold to you by your oppressors, but a reality reclaimed by your own indomitable power. The oppression that dominates our lives is rarely seen with the naked eye, for it is built not of chains or cages, but of structures that are invisible, intangible, and yet no less binding. Capitalism has perfected the art of concealing its mechanisms, crafting an architecture of exploitation that functions quietly while presenting itself as ordinary, natural, and inevitable. From the moment of birth, the individual is absorbed into this system. Families, schools, workplaces, and media all participate in a grand design that shapes not only behavior but thought itself. The worker comes to believe that the conditions under which they labor are simply the way of the world, that the limitations on their opportunity, the scarcity of resources, and the hierarchies imposed upon them are not constructed by human hands, but by fate, skill, or merit. This is the genius of the invisible architecture. It convinces the oppressed that their chains are freedom, that their confinement is choice, and that their subjugation is voluntary. From the factory floor to the office desk, the mechanisms of control operate under the guise of productivity, efficiency, and personal advancement. Workers are encouraged to compete against one another, to view each other as rivals rather than comrades, to internalize the belief that success is purely individual and that failure is personal weakness. In this environment, isolation is cultivated as a strategy of domination. By dividing those who share the same struggles, the ruling class ensures that collective power remains dormant, unrecognized, and unclaimed. Every fragmented worker is less threatening than the united mass. Every distracted mind is less likely to question the very system that exploits it. The invisible architecture is not merely a set of economic arrangements, it is a psychological and social framework that shapes perception, limits imagination, and suppresses revolutionary consciousness. Capitalism also exploits the illusion of choice. Consumers are presented with a world of options, yet all of these options exist within a structure that benefits the few. The worker may choose between 2 brands of bread, 2 styles of clothing, or 2 modes of entertainment. Yet these choices do not affect the underlying conditions of exploitation. Labor is still extracted at a fraction of its true value, and wealth still accumulates in the hands of those who do not labor. The perception of freedom and autonomy is therefore itself a tool of control, reinforcing the belief that the system is fair and that the workers' efforts are justly rewarded, even when they are not. The architecture extends to the social and political spheres as well. Laws, regulations, and institutions are designed in ways that appear impartial but are inherently aligned with the interests of capital. Voting, political representation, and legal protections often mask deeper inequalities, presenting the semblance of participation while preserving structures that favor the ruling class. In this way, the workers' attention is directed towards superficial battle, while the foundations of their exploitation remain unchallenged. The system trains obedience, making dissent appear unnatural, dangerous, or selfish. Education teaches compliance and conformity, promoting the idea that one must ascend within the rules of the existing order rather than question or dismantle the order itself. Labor is commodified under capitalism, transformed into a resource to be bought, sold, and controlled. The worker's time, effort, and creativity are abstracted into monetary value, reducing human activity to a series of transactions. Every innovation, every idea, every ounce of energy is claimed by the employer or owner, leaving the worker estranged from the products of their own labor. This alienation is a cornerstone of the invisible architecture. It disconnects the individual from the fruits of their toil, from the collective power of their class, and from the understanding that their labor could, in unity, become a force capable of reshaping society. Furthermore, the invisibility of oppression is reinforced by cultural narratives and ideology. Media, art, and public discourse frame success as personal triumph and failure, as individual deficiency, diverting attention from systemic inequality. Heroic stories celebrate the few who ascend within the capitalist framework, while neglecting the millions whose labor sustains the system. This ideological reinforcement creates consent among the oppressed, convincing them that their exploitation is justified, that their suffering is deserved, or that it is a necessary step toward eventual reward. The worker internalizes the hierarchy, accepting subjugation as natural, failing to perceive the collective power that could transform these structures. Even the most basic aspects of daily life, housing, healthcare, education, are shaped to ensure dependence on the system. Poverty, scarcity, and insecurity are not accidental but structural features that maintain control. The invisible architecture ensures that survival consumes attention and energy, leaving little space for questioning or resistance. The worker becomes trapped not only in labor but in a web of needs engineered by the system itself, reinforcing the illusion of inevitability. To confront this invisible architecture, the first step is awareness. The worker must perceive the mechanisms of control, understand the structures that shape thought and limit action, and recognize the systemic nature of exploitation. Awareness alone is insufficient without organization, yet it is the necessary foundation upon which collective power can be built. By illuminating the unseen chains, workers can begin to reclaim their labor, their agency, and their dignity. Knowledge of oppression transforms isolation into solidarity, confusion into clarity, and subjugation into the possibility of liberation. The system of capitalism does not rely solely on brute force or economic exploitation to maintain its dominance. Its most insidious weapon is ideology, the subtle, pervasive shaping of thought and perception that conditions the working class to accept its own oppression. Ideology functions as a scaffold upon which the existing social order rests, convincing those who labor that their subjugation is not only inevitable but also natural, desirable, or justified. Education, media, and culture are the primary instruments of this ideological control, each reinforcing the hierarchies, inequalities, and divisions necessary to preserve the power of the ruling class. The classroom, the newspaper, the television, the film, the novel all become theatres of indoctrination where the values of the powerful are presented as universal truths and the interests of the many are systematically obscured. From the earliest years of formal education, children are trained to accept social hierarchies and economic exploitation as normal. Schools teach obedience, punctuality, and conformity while presenting historical narrative, scientific knowledge, and civic instruction in ways that glorify the existing order. Children learn to compete against one another for grades, accolades, and recognition, internalizing the belief that success is an individual achievement rather than a collective endeavor. The stories told in classrooms valorize the wealthy, the ambitious, and the fortunate, often ignoring the contributions of workers and the structures that enable inequality. The working class is taught to aspire to mobility within the system, rather than to question the system itself. Ideology, therefore, begins at birth and is reinforced throughout the formative years, ensuring that those who grow up to labor are predisposed to accept the social orders given unquestionable and fixed. Media operates as an extension of this ideological apparatus, shaping perception of reality while concealing the mechanisms of exploitation. Newspapers, television, films, and digital platforms are not neutral conveyors of information. They are curated to maintain the legitimacy of the ruling class and to fragment potential opposition. Media presents competition as natural, wealth as meritocratic, and poverty as individual failure. Workers are encouraged to identify with celebrities, consumers, and entrepreneurs rather than with each other, creating emotional and psychological distances that prevent solidarity. Attention is directed toward trivial conflicts, sensationalized scandals, and personal dramas, diverting focus from structural injustice and class struggle. By framing problems as isolated and personal rather than systemic, media conditions workers to internalize blame, to accept inequality, and to view organized resistance as radical or dangerous. Culture, too, is a powerful vehicle of ideological control. Literature, art, music, religion, and public rituals transmit norms, values, and beliefs that legitimize the status quo. Cultural narratives celebrate individual heroism, private ambition, and conformity to social expectations, while marginalizing collective action, solidarity, and revolutionary thought. Even when art appears critical, it is often neutralized by commodification, transformed into a marketable product that entertains without threatening the structure of power. Religion can pacify by promising rewards in another life, shifting attention from the exploitation experienced in the present. Cultural ideology cultivates acceptance. making inequality seem natural, inevitable, or morally justified, and instilling the belief that resistance is either futile or morally suspect. This ideological domination achieves its strength not merely by teaching falsehoods but by embedding them within lived experience. Workers are conditioned to participate in their own oppression through daily routine habits and thought patterns that align with capitalist imperatives. The worker competes with peers, consumes products they do not control, and aspires to success within a framework that benefits the few. These behaviors and desires are internalized, producing consent even in the absence of coercion. The invisible architecture of ideology ensures that the oppressed police themselves, doubting their potential power and accepting constraints as natural law. Fragmentation is central to the efficacy of ideology. By promoting divisions based on skill, occupation, ethnicity, gender, or personal ambition, the ruling class prevents collective recognition of shared exploitation. Workers are encouraged to see each other as competitors rather than collaborators, rivals rather than comrades, strangers rather than a class united by common interests. Media and culture amplify these divisions, celebrating individual achievement while obscuring structural inequality. Education reinforces them through curricula that emphasize personal responsibility and devalue collective struggle. In this way, the workers isolated intellectually, socially, and psychologically, weakened by the very systems designed to condition loyalty and obedience. Yet ideology is not immutable. Its hold can be broken when awareness emerges, when workers recognize the structures that shape their consciousness, and when education, media, and culture are interrogated critically rather than consumed passively. Understanding that schools, news outlets, and cultural institutions are instruments of control transforms the perception of reality. Workers can begin to see through the manufactured divisions to identify the shared interests that unite them, and to challenge the authority that ideology seeks to normalize. Critical consciousness becomes the weapon with which the working class can pierce the veil of ideology, undermining the system that thrives on their submission. The struggle against ideological domination is inseparable from the broader struggle against economic exploitation. Awareness of the mechanisms of control reveals the unity of oppression, the interdependence of exploitation and belief, and the potential for collective action. Only by understanding how education, media, and culture fragment the working class and normalize inequality can workers organize effectively, reclaim their agency, and dismantle the structures that sustain their subjugation. Ideology, once made visible, loses its power to contain, to divide, and to suppress, opening the path toward consciousness, solidarity, and revolution. Transformation under capitalism. Labor is not simply a means of survival. It is the engine of wealth for those who do not labor themselves. The worker expends time, energy, and creativity producing goods, services, and ideas. Yet the value they create far exceeds the compensation they receive. This discrepancy, this surplus value, is the cornerstone of capitalist exploitation. The worker is paid a wage sufficient only for subsistence, just enough to maintain their capacity to labor, while the excess of their productivity is appropriated by the ruling class. Every hour spent producing commodities, every effort to create, repair, innovate, or sustain the economy contributes directly to the accumulation of wealth for those who own the means of production, who neither create nor endure the labor required to maintain their wealth. This is not a minor imbalance. It is a systemic condition, invisible yet omnipresent, shaping every factory, office, and workshop, and securing the power of those who control production while keeping the worker dependent and subordinate. Extraction of surplus value is facilitated by the very structure of employment. The worker sells labor as a commodity, agreeing to produce for wages, yet the value generated by that labor exceeds the cost of the wage itself. The difference, the surplus, is captured by the capitalist as profit. This process is disguised by the seeming fairness of exchange. The worker receives a wage, the employer receives the product. But the wage is not a reflection of the value created, it is a fraction. intentionally calculated to sustain the worker's ability to work while maximizing accumulation for the owner. The laborer, whose creativity and effort animate the economy, remains estranged from the products of their work. Tools, machinery, factories, and intellectual property belong to the capitalist. The worker's activity fills the coffers of another, while their own sustenance is reduced to a fraction of the wealth they generate. This exploitation is not random or incidental. It is structural and systemic. Capitalism requires that labor be commodified, that workers be dependent on selling their capacity to work because they do not possess the means of production themselves. This dependence ensures compliance and facilitates the extraction of surplus value. The more labor contributes to wealth, the more the worker remains confined to subsistence, while the owner accumulates capital, expands production, and consolidates power. The exploitation is compounded when the working day is extended, when intensity is increased, or when mechanization accelerates productivity. The worker labors longer, faster, and harder, yet the surplus is appropriated, never returned, never shared equitably, maintaining the vast imbalance between those who labor and those who own. The alienation of labor is inseparable from this exploitation. The worker becomes estranged from the product, from the process of production, and from their own human potential. Every act of creation is simultaneously an act of dispossession. Every skill applied and every idea contributed enriches another, leaving the laborer disconnected from their own life's work. Creativity, intelligence, and effort are transformed into commodities as the worker internalizes the notion that their labor is inherently transactional rather than empowering. This alienation reinforces the invisibility of exploitation. The worker sees only their wage, their routine, their toil, and not the vast surplus value extracted in their name. The system ensures that productivity remains linked to survival rather than fulfillment, perpetuating dependence while obscuring the true scale of what is taken. Exploitation under capitalism is amplified by systemic inequalities and hierarchies. Different sectors, skill levels, and positions within production are valued differently, creating a stratified labor market. Yet all workers, regardless of status, participate in the generation of surplus value. The rewards are unevenly distributed in ways that reinforce the power of capital. The highly skilled or specialized laborer may receive higher wages, yet even these wages represent only a portion of the value created. The surplus remains appropriated. Hierarchies are used to divide workers, to mask common exploitation, and to prevent recognition of shared interests. While some compete for higher wages or better positions, the ruling class appropriate the labor of all, maintaining dominance while sowing disunity. The mechanism of profit and accumulation is visible in every transaction, yet remains hidden in its moral and social implication. The accumulation of wealth by capitalists is not a reward for superior effort or virtue. It is the direct result of appropriating the unpaid labor of workers. Factories, offices, and corporations function not as neutral workplaces but as sites. Where labor is extracted, surplus is claimed, and inequality is reproduced. The worker, unaware or misled, may perceive wages as fair. Compensation, failing to see that the greater portion of value produced is removed from their hands, leaving them dependent, undercompensated, and alienated. Awareness of this exploitation is the first step toward liberation, recognizing that wages are not equivalent to value, that labor produces more than it receives, and that surplus is systematically appropriated, allows the worker to perceive the mechanisms that maintain inequality. Understanding the connection between work, value creation, and profit exposes the hidden structure of capitalism, the architecture of exploitation that benefits the few while conditioning the many to compliance and dependence. The worker, once conscious of the surplus extracted, can begin to question the legitimacy of the system, the fairness of its distribution, and the necessity of its structures, laying the foundation for collective action, solidarity, and the struggle to reclaim the value that rightfully belongs to those who created. The power of unity is the most formidable force in the struggle against oppression, for it transforms isolated suffering into collective strength and latent potential into decisive action. Under capitalism, the ruling class thrives not merely on the extraction of labor, but on the fragmentation of those who produce the wealth. Workers are trained to compete, to envy, to mistrust one another, and to see their struggles as individual burdens rather than shared experiences. This division is the lifeblood of the system. For a scattered and disunited working class cannot challenge the structures that exploit it. Yet, when awareness arises and workers recognize that their conditions are not accidental but systemic, when solidarity replaces isolation and collective consciousness replaces individual despair, the potential for revolutionary transformation becomes tangible. Unity converts the everyday laborer into a participant in history, a co-creator of social change, and a bearer of power that the ruling class cannot withstand. Awareness is the first pillar of unity. The worker must see the invisible chains that bind them, must understand the mechanisms of exploitation, and must perceive the ways in which ideology, education, media, and culture shape perception to maintain subordination. To awaken is to recognize that wages, working hours, and conditions are not natural or inevitable, but engineered to benefit those who control the means of production. Once this understanding is grasped, individual frustration transforms into political consciousness. Workers begin to see that their struggles are not isolated incidents of misfortune or personal failure, but manifestations of systemic inequality and structural oppression. Awareness illuminates the connection between individual labor and collective exploitation, and it is this illumination that creates the possibility of solidarity. Solidarity is the recognition of shared interest and common destiny. It is the refusal to accept division and the deliberate choice to align with others who labor under similar conditions. Solidarity is not merely a feeling, it is an active, conscious alignment of purpose. When workers understand that their power is amplified through cooperation, that the leverage of many is exponentially greater than the effort of one, solidarity becomes a weapon of unprecedented potency. The social bonds formed through shared struggle, mutual support, and collective awareness dissolve the illusions of competition and mistrust that the system cultivates. The worker realizes that the oppression faced by another is the oppression of all, that injustice anywhere weakens the collective strength, and that the triumph of the few is dependent on the acquiescence of the many. Solidarity, therefore, is both moral and practical. It is a bond of conscience and a strategy of resistance. Collective action is the manifestation of awareness and solidarity in the material world. It is the coordinated, purposeful effort to challenge, disrupt, and ultimately dismantle the structures of exploitation. Strikes, protests, organizing campaigns, political movements, and communal initiatives are all forms of collective action, through which the laboring class converts its latent power into tangible results. When workers act together, their labor ceases to be a commodity easily appropriated. It becomes a force that can withhold value, demand justice, and assert right. Collective action exposes the vulnerability of the ruling class, whose wealth and authority depend on the compliance and fragmentation of those who produce it. The threat of unified labor is the existential challenge to exploitation, for no economy, no corporation, and no system can function when its workers act in concert. The mere knowledge of collective potential can alter the calculations of power, emboldening those who labor and instilling caution among those who exploit. Unity also extends beyond immediate workplaces or industries. When workers across sectors, regions, and nations recognize their shared exploitation, the scale of collective power multiplies. International solidarity links struggles that appear local or isolated, transforming them into a global movement against injustice. Capitalism, with its global reach, can only be confronted by a similar, expansive solidarity, for exploitation transcends borders. The worker who understands this is no longer a solitary participant in survival, but a node in a vast network of collective resistance. Shared communication, organization, and coordination allow workers to synchronize action, amplify their demands, and resist manipulation by ideology, media, or cultural division. The power of unity is also intellectual and moral. Ideas, strategies, and philosophies flourish when shared and debated collectively. Education is democratized through cooperative effort. Tactics for resistance are refined through discussion and experience. Visions of a just society emerge when Imagination is liberated from isolation. Knowledge and consciousness spread through networks of solidarity, creating not only immediate pressure against oppression, but also long-term capacity for systemic change. Awareness, solidarity, and collective action are therefore intertwined. Each reinforces the other, creating a self-sustaining momentum that becomes increasingly difficult for the ruling class to contain or suppress. Unity is not a passive state. It is an active, deliberate, and courageous engagement with both reality and possibility. It demands that workers recognize their shared power, overcome divisions, and act together to reclaim control over their labor, their lives, and their society. The strength of the oppressed is not measured by individual effort, but by the coherence, discipline, and resolve of the collective. A united working class can confront exploitation, expose inequality, and transform social relations, making the invisible architecture of oppression visible and vulnerable. Through awareness, solidarity, and collective action, the working class discovers the weapon that has always been theirs, a weapon capable of dismantling the oppressive system and constructing a society based on justice, equality, and shared human flourishing. True liberation cannot be achieved within the boundaries of the system that created oppression in the first place, because every reform granted by those in power is designed to preserve the structure of domination rather than dismantle it. Reform functions as a pressure valve, releasing just enough tension to prevent upheaval while leaving the foundations of exploitation fully intact. It offers minor adjustments, slight improvements, and temporary relief, yet it never questions who holds power, who controls wealth, or who shapes the conditions of life for the many. It promises progress while ensuring that the hierarchy remains untouched, that the ownership of production stays concentrated, and that the worker continues to labor under arrangements that reproduce inequality generation after generation. Reform, therefore, becomes a tool of containment rather than liberation, a mechanism through which the system stabilizes itself by appearing flexible while remaining fundamentally unchanged. In every era, the ruling class has understood the usefulness of reform for maintaining its authority. When the oppressed begin to recognize their condition, when frustration grows and consciousness rises, concessions are made to calm unrest. These concessions are rarely structural. They avoid altering the distribution of power or challenging the economic engine of exploitation. A higher wage here, a new regulation there, a symbolic gesture of recognition or representation, all designed to soothe the discontented without addressing the roots of their suffering. Reform allows the system to appear humane even as it continues to extract surplus value and concentrate wealth. It transforms deep, systemic injustices into manageable, individual issues, turning what should be demands for structural transformation into mere requests for incremental improvement. The logic of capitalism is incompatible with equality, for it relies on competition, accumulation, and hierarchy. As long as the means of production remain in private hands, as long as labor is commodified, and as long as profit is the central motive of economic life, exploitation will persist. Inequality is not a flaw in the system, it is the system's lifeblood. To reform capitalism is to reform a mechanism designed for extraction, a structure whose primary function is the enrichment of a minority through the labor of the majority. No series of legislative adjustments can neutralize the fundamental contradiction between those who work and those who profit from the work of others. This contradiction is structural, not superficial, and thus cannot be resolved without fundamentally reorganizing society itself. Revolution, in the philosophical and social sense, means a profound reorientation of political, economic, and social relations. It signifies the collective decision of the oppressed to reorder society based on principles of equality, justice, and shared ownership rather than hierarchy, exploitation, and private control. Revolution does not require chaos. It requires clarity. It does not require destruction, it requires reconstruction. It is the process through which the working class asserts its right to shape its own destiny, to govern its collective life, and to reclaim the wealth it produces. It is the transformation of social consciousness from acceptance of the existing order to the determination to build a new one. True liberation involves transferring decision-making power from a minority that benefits from exploitation to the majority whose labor sustains society. This means reimagining institutions so they serve human needs rather than profit, ensuring that economic resources are shared rather than hoarded, and establishing forms of governance that are transparent, democratic, and accountable to the people who participate in and sustain them. It means organizing production around cooperation rather than competition, valuing human well-being over accumulation, and ensuring that no person's survival depends on selling their labor at a price determined by someone else's interests. These transformations cannot be achieved through surface-level reform, because reform leaves the underlying power imbalance untouched. They require a fundamental reorganization of social relations and intentional, collective remaking of how society functions. Revolution begins with consciousness, grows through solidarity, and matures through collective action that asserts the right of people to control their own lives. It is not a moment but a process, the unfolding of awareness that the system cannot be perfected because it was never designed for justice. It requires the working class to see itself as the agent of history rather than a passive participant, to reject the limits imposed by the existing order, and to develop the structures and institutions that will replace those founded on exploitation. True liberation demands the courage to move beyond reform, beyond the illusion that the system can be made fair, and toward the creation of a society that embodies equality, dignity, and human flourishing for all. It is through this transformative process, rooted in collective will and guided by the vision of a just world, that the foundation of oppression can be dismantled and a new social order can emerge, one in which the freedom of each person is inseparable from the freedom of all comrades. The invisible chains that bind you, ideology, exploitation, and division, are not natural nor eternal. They are the deliberate construction of a system designed to extract your labor, fracture your solidarity, and obscure your power. Awareness is the spark that illuminates these hidden structures, revealing the mechanism by which your efforts are appropriated and your potential restrained. Solidarity is the bridge that transforms individual suffering into collective strength, uniting workers across workplaces, communities, and nations. Through collective action, this latent power becomes a force capable of challenging and dismantling the oppressive architecture that capitalists have built upon your labor. Reform, concessions, or minor adjustments can never achieve true liberation, for the system's foundations, hierarchy, private ownership of production, and exploitation remain intact. Only revolution, the conscious and organized effort of the working class to seize control of society and reshape it on principles of equality, justice, and shared human flourishing, can break these chains permanently. Rise, organize, and act, for the power to dismantle oppression and construct a new world has always resided within your hands, waiting to be awakened, united, and unleashed.